afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And hello, Lara.
Hello. Oh my God, Jonathan, I love that intro. I've got all goosebumps.
So yeah, a little intro so that people know we are broadcasting, just in case they think the picture's frozen. I saw a very funny comedy sketch today. Do you remember the West one? And it was the BBC Olympic thing, those comedy sketches.
Yeah.
Hugh Bonneville was in it, and they did this sketch where there was a grumpy lady. I've never really seen it before, and she's like this.
Oh.
And they're saying, "Oh, I think we've lost Anna. She's frozen." She goes, "No, I just haven't said anything."
I know. I was like,
there's been going around. There's been a lot going on. So, how's your week been?
Well, it's been very hectic. I've got to say. Last week I had a baby named after me. I had gifts sent to my house, right? Yeah, exactly. And what was it? I was nominated for some awards, right? So we had quite a few. It's a very busy week. I've had to take a couple of days off, actually, laterally, I've got to say. So very busy, lots happening, and the energy feels much more positive. How about you?
I've had an interesting week. It's been busy. I've carried on doing my live lockdown vigils. And this Saturday, I was very lucky to do Mitchell Priory, the great Mitchell Priory in East Sussex in Upper Dicker. Fantastic location, so much history. So I was locked down in this building, broadcasting live. I was only intending to do 2 hours worth, ended up doing a 3-hour broadcast. Quite exhausting. With the biggest spiders I've ever seen in my life, which was freaking me out the whole time. In fact, I've got a picture I can show you. There's someone was watching these screens. They were live. Yeah. I was sitting in the lone vigil area, which is actually the dining room. There's the great staircase, which is top right. There is the gatehouse, a completely separate building, top left, bottom left rather. And then there's a Tudor kitchen, which was actually the refectory for the monks, bottom right. And I hadn't noticed it at the time because I was too busy trying to work on the live streams and avoiding the spiders. But if you stare very closely at the bottom right picture, you can see there's an old table, and behind that is a very massive fireplace. There is, halfway through the table, is a vertical beam of a light grey stone, and just edging into that from the right-hand side is something that looks like a bit of a body, perhaps a hat, a little bit like he's wearing sunglasses, which is a bit irrelevant. But several people have spotted that, which I hadn't spotted at the time. I wish I could zoom in on this, but I can't. Unfortunately, all you can do is see that. But it is interesting that there was that little thing. And I have also then got... Jordan wants to go to the kitchen. So interesting, while we were chatting, and very often what we find is whenever we chat about stuff, sometimes spirits make their presence felt. So what? I thought I saw someone outside the window. There, whenever we chat about stuff, sometimes spirits make their presence felt. So what?
Wow.
It's very difficult to see, but what was happening is that there's something appeared in the background through the windows, and in the ceiling above there was this effect as if someone had walked in front of the window, and their light that was coming in from the window was being broken as if there was somebody outside the window, but there was no one outside. Again, it's something that two of us had seen, and then when one of the viewers basically had gone in, processed that, we edited that bit of video and could see that there was definitely a shadow of something moving in front of that window. It was translucent, and there's no explanation as to what that was. So that was a great weekend.
You've had a fabulous weekend, haven't you?
But when you get in at like 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm not used to late nights anymore. It was like,
so you take a couple of days to kind of recharge and reboot from that evening.
Yes. So wipe out on Sunday, put it that way.
Oh, Sunday. I love it.
So anything else interesting happening this week?
God, I think you probably caught me on the hop there. I'm actually really looking forward to speaking with Dr. Jack Hunter, I've got to say, about fairies. I've kind of been brandishing it about, some of the people in my groups and stuff, and they were delighted that we were going to be tackling this subject. How about you?
Well, we're gonna go.
Can't admit that there's not a bit of smidgen of curiosity.
There's a massive curiosity about fairies. Now we're going to start with fairies, but we're going to go much deeper. We're going to go into a much deeper subject about ecology completely. In fact, let's just bring in Dr. Jack Hunter himself.
Okay.
All right, he's watching. Hi, Dr. Jack, how are you?
How are you?
How is your lockdown experience going?
It's all right, really. Getting to spend a lot of time in the garden. I live out in the middle of sort of rural mid Wales, so not much has changed other than all my teaching is from home.
Oh, even better.
Yeah.
So, Jack, your background is not anthropology. It doesn't even touch the surface of really what you do. Do you want to just say what you're currently working on? You're lecturing as well, so just tell us about yourselves.
Well, what I'm currently working on, the biggest project I've got at the moment is recreating a module for a master's course in ecology and spirituality. And this is the big project that I'm doing at the moment, sorting out the core module. And it's going to be all about sort of like introducing master's students to the science of ecology and thinking about why ecology is something that might be related to spirituality. Then we'll go on and talk about things like what is spirituality. And then as the weeks go on, it's a 10-week module. As the weeks go on, we'll delve into things like animism, reciprocal ontologies, different ways of thinking about our relationship with the world. And then we delve into sort of the greening the paranormal, kind of the relationship between near-death experiences and UFO abductions and ecological consciousness and all that kind of stuff.
So, I mean, it's a broad spectrum of subject fields you're talking about. We've got a lot to cover. The reason I wanted to get you in and so we could talk about this is we're going to start with the article that you wrote for the Supernatural magazine on fairies at the bottom of the garden. Now, it's a nice intro way in talking about a much bigger subject. It's not just about the fairies themselves, but it's actually about what those fairies represent. And for example, I would argue you're very unlikely to see fairies in a concrete building. You wouldn't imagine a fairy in an office block. When you think of fairies, by definition, you're talking either bottom of a garden or a woodland environment. And that's bringing us onto the ecosystem. So in terms of what you wrote for the magazine, there was a fascinating thing about the fairy census. So could you tell us anything about the background of where fairies really came from?
Yeah, well, the Fairy census was a great project. It was done by a folklorist called Simon Young a few years ago. And basically what he wanted to do was find out, in the contemporary modern world are still having fairy experiences, the kinds of things that people were reporting, way back in the day, medieval times and so on. And, not surprisingly, people are still having these kinds of experiences. And one of the things that I was interested in fact, I even submitted my own experience to the census when it's going around. And one of the things that I noticed when I was reading through it, and Simon's picked up on it as well, is that most of the encounters that people have with fairies seem to take place in either garden settings or in woodland areas, green spaces. So I can't remember the exact figures off the top of my head, but I think I've mentioned them in the article. There's quite a high percentage of the experiences, of 500 experiences in this census, all manner of different kinds of fairy experiences. But quite a high percentage of those have actually taken place in gardens or in sort of outdoor woodland settings. Yep, there it is.
Just getting up the article.
Yeah, so it seems to me that there's some kind of a connection here that, perhaps woodland or outdoor environments are more conducive to fairy experiences. We could take it in a number of different directions. Perhaps there are factors in the environment that induce in us like altered states of consciousness or whatever, or there could be a higher geomagnetic activity in certain outdoor spaces that give rise to strange experiences. Or we could take it down the other direction and say that perhaps, the fairies and things that people encounter in these situations and these different locales are kind of like the spirit of the place, or, a genius loci. The fairies.
Oh.
So yeah, there's a couple of different ways we could take it. We could say either there are certain spaces that give rise to, hallucinatory experiences and things like that, or perhaps there are places where there is actually something that dwells in the land that we can interact with, or more likely, it's both.
One of the things I was curious about was the sightings and the fact that very often traditionally we think of children seeing the fairies, and we're obviously reminded of the cautionary fairies that were a huge fan of course, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who supported these, and the idea that these children were seeing these fairies. And surely the concept of children, of fairies at the bottom of the garden, is really delivered to children. But the sensors really showed it was actually adults that were seeing them, even though, as you pointed out in your article, it's really children spending a lot of time in the garden, but they're not the ones reporting the fairies.
Yeah, and Simon Young pointed this out, that children and adults seem to be encountering different kinds of fairies in the garden. So, you know, adults would encounter plant spirits or flower fairies, and you might expect children to encounter the same, but actually children tended to report more encounters with kind of like tree spirits. So yeah, there's something interesting going on, that I don't know why it would be that adults tend to have encounters with, you know, flower fairies or smaller kind of plant spirits or whatever it is, but there seems to be some kind of an interesting correlation there. Could be something to do with age. I don't know, but it's interesting. But all of those experiences take place in gardens and outdoor spaces.
I mean, there could be a possibility that the child sees something and then doesn't feel a necessity to share it with an adult. It's a personal thing to them, whereas an adult is, oh my God, I've seen a fairy. It'd be sort of quite a reclamatory thing. They want to try and share that experience.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, on your blog, I noticed you've just written about sacred spaces and you created your own.
Yeah,
I find that fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of an extension of this idea of fairies at the bottom of the garden, really. So one of the things I was thinking is, you know, why is it that people have these experiences in wild spaces? One of the ideas I explored in Greening the Paranormal is that, you know, when we talk about biodiversity, different forms of life, you know, plants and animals and things all coexisting, we're also talking about different ways of experiencing and thinking about the world. So, you know, animals obviously experience the world and think about the world in completely different ways to us. And there's more and more research coming out to suggest that plants also experience the world in certain ways, and they have intelligence and memory and all of that kind of stuff. So when we're talking about biodiversity, we're also talking about psychodiversity, you know, all of these different forms of intelligence and consciousness that have evolved in the world. So this correlation between encountering fairies, which are a form of other than human consciousness, you know, they're non-human consciousness that people seem to experience in these biodiverse places like gardens and wilderness areas, you know, it seems to suggest that perhaps we're tapping into that psychodiversity and somehow when we're engaging in these locations. So I thought it'd be a nice experiment, you know, and it's something that anyone can do. And it doesn't matter whether you believe in fairies or not, it's still a good thing to do. You know, create a space in your garden where natural processes are allowed to take place, you know, without you interfering in them.
Absolutely.
Corner off a corner of the garden, and then by enhancing the biodiversity in that location, then you're also enhancing, you know, the psychodiversity as well. And I think, you know, if you have access to a space that is biodiverse and so also psychodiverse, then perhaps you have more of a chance of encountering, you know, other forms of consciousness, fairies.
I'm going to bring Lara back in. Hopefully, caught her unawares. Lara, we're talking about sacred spaces. Now, in terms of spirituality, it's probably recommended that you do have we all benefit from our own little space that we can then go to and reflect, whether interior, exterior, in terms of meditation. And obviously, with all of us being in lockdown in the past, we've all struggled for space. And luckily, because of the weather, we've all had an external space to go to. And probably lots of people have now found nature and much more aware and observant of nature than we've ever done before. I've had loads of comments from people saying, I've never noticed that coming to blossom. Isn't that green? And I think it's always been that, but they've just never been that time. Do you feel it's important to have spaces for own reflection, a sacred space that becomes your own in terms of contacting spirituality?
Absolutely. Lockdown, I've noticed even the birds, they're cheap, you know, the little cheeps that they do, all the little individual sounds that they're making, right? The vibrational frequencies that you're hearing them on, even the rustling of the plants and the leaves, and there's a vibration with everything living, as you know, there's a vibration, all right? And I think having that sacred space, developing and nurturing your own vortex, if you want to call it, right? That sacred space, you know, being aware, because these type of things happen all the time. We're just so busy, we don't notice them, right? And then, of course, you get people like, you know, Dr. Hunter and myself coming along, you know, and we're kind of wired to actually feeling and intersecting those frequencies to the point that, you know, our senses gather them in a certain place, right, and transform them into some sort of communication or meaning to ourselves. And it can be such a difficult thing to actually convey to other people. You know, credit to Dr. Hunter for writing about this, right? Because, you know, I'm a medium and so I'm very well adverse to, you know, when you stand up in that and say, oh, by the way, did you know that this was going on over here? You get a whole society that pitch against you, you know, and go, nah, it's just a pile of you know what, you know, nah, you've got to be off your head, you know, type thing. But there's so much more that goes on that you're not aware of. So the lockdown has been a gift in many senses, hasn't it? Dr. Hunter, it's been a gift.
Yeah.
Yes, my grandfather caught a picture of a fairy at the bottom of his garden.
Wow.
Many, many years ago. All right, now, look, that's Jonathan. He's now exited the building. Did you see that? Maybe he's gone. One picture, he was a photographer and he had his own darkroom, right? So he developed his own pictures. And I remember as a little girl going through, you know, thinking, wow, you know, my grandfather did this. And he had this picture underneath, there was a fairy underneath a flower. I know it was a white flower, but I can't remember actually what type it was. I was very young, and being impressed that my grandfather had caught one on his camera. He never did again after that. I remember asking him about it and he was like, shh, you know, keep it hush hush. He was a very quiet, non-assuming man. He was in the Secret Service in the you know, the World War II and stuff. He knew how to keep secrets, let's just say. But I regret asking him later on in life, you know, about the whole sequence of events leading up to that. He was the kind of guy that made bird tables for the garden, you know, always saw to nature. So I think you're more wired to nature. After all, you get people that love just being in the gardens. It's like a meditation to them, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So when you're in that space, remove the external. My God, people, you see a whole new world.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because there's a whole load of, in sort of like the history of religions, there's a great book called Dark Green Religion, which I'm going to use as a core text in this module that I'm developing. And it talks about how, you know, you get people like scientists, naturalists, people who are, you know, scientifically minded, but they go out into the world and they spend time in the wilderness. They spend time interacting with animals and things. And sure enough, they end up having sort of like mystical experiences that transform their way of understanding the world. And I saw something recently about Jane Goodall's mystical experiences in nature, for example.
Wow.
So something about nature, being in natural environments, interacting with the world in that way that gives rise to this kind of
my God, it allows the mind to shift. We become so entrenched in dogma, in conditioning from society, right? They're telling us that we have to think a certain way, but actually vibrationally attuning yourself to nature, right? And the life that goes on there, it opens up a whole new world. I totally hear you, totally. And I think the lockdown has been a gift for that.
Yeah.
Which brings us nicely on to the main subject matter, your book, Greening the Paranormal. Now, this is fascinating. It took me a while to get my head around it. As a physicist, the whole concept of it, to me, when I was wanting to study the sciences, it was straight away maths, physics, chemistry. Biology was just icky stuff I wasn't really interested in. Because basically, if you understood physics, maths, and chemistry, everything else would explain itself. Biology was just a byproduct of organic chemistry. And so branching on to psychology and ecology with two subject matters, I was like, okay. And it took me a while to understand, but I got it eventually. I was like getting it. So I understand, particularly when you refer to how ecology comes into religion and how obviously the world religions have progressed onto realizing that really they've got to get a grip of ecology. They've got to make a statement about ecology. It's no good. And your what you said about the monotheistic. I can say that word now. What's the word?
Monotheistic.
Thank you. Religions, and because I also do a lot of history, and of course, then the whole social history of the Victorians is all about industry for God, and really the stamp of the Industrial Revolution was done in the name of the Christian God, but really they had no concept of the environment around them. It was all about industry and efficiency and product and power. which of course we're now seeing as a byproduct of Black Lives Matter as well. It's like it was all about commerce, and the environment didn't come. And now, of course, this century we're seeing the damage being done, and the religions having to go, oh, actually, maybe we should have stepped in earlier about this whole subject matter.
Yeah. I mean, the world religions, I think it was in 2016. It was after, maybe it was the Paris climate summit, and the world religions, like, you know, the Catholic Church and the top of the Hindu faith and all these kind of things, released a whole load of statements about you know, religious responses to climate change and the role that religion can play. And I think, you know, it's not something that people really think about. You know, we think about climate change and all that kind of stuff as a, like you say, like a scientific problem that we solve with technology and stuff. But like you've just said, you know, with the example of God, you know, industry being directed towards God or for God, it's also a religious and a spiritual problem. So it's you know, as much as it's about technology and that kind of stuff, it's also about the way that we think about our place in the world and understand our role in it. And obviously religion, in dealing with, you know, beliefs and in providing a kind of like a worldview for people, it's uniquely placed to get people to rethink their relationship with the world. And actually, when you delve down to the core of a lot of religious traditions, they actually promote a kind of an image of an interconnected cosmos, of a world where we are connected to, you know, divine forces, to spirits and things like that. So yeah, I think religion is an interesting case because, like you say, in part it's been responsible for the damage that's been done, but it also offers, and spirituality, or, you know, however we frame our relationship with the world, it also offers us a kind of a route out of it by changing the things that we believe in or the things that we think about. Then we can change the way that we behave as well.
And branching on from that subject matter, and of course we were completely paying attention to what you were saying and not watching the cat at all. In terms of then how the green and the paranormal, so taking the idea that really, obviously now the world religions are saying we need to get a grip of ecology, that is a statement is then coming on to the world politics. But your suggestion is that the whole world of the paranormal has an ability then to involve themselves with ecological matters as well.
Yeah, that's one of the strands in my introduction, is that, you know, paranormal research groups, or, you know, people who are interested in parapsychology and all of that kind of stuff also have a role to play, because, you know, paranormal research is all about engaging with different kinds of consciousness, or, you know, discarnate spirits and things like that. So essentially, it's dealing with the same kind of, you know, the same kind of issues as ecology is. You know, how do we live in relationship with other forms of consciousness, other minds? So I think actually the paranormal, or the paranormal field, and also parapsychology and things like that have a lot to teach us, like culturally, about how to engage with, you know, other than human consciousness. I think when you look at the paranormal overall, if you take it, you know, taking everything from, you know, UFOs and spirits and mediums to Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and all of that kind of stuff, essentially what you get is kind of like an animistic worldview. You know, it's a world, it's a view, an image of the world that is populated by, you know, different kinds of minds, different kinds of creatures. So I think really, you know, ecology and paranormal research have come to the same point, but from quite different perspectives. But it's also a position that resonates really nicely with, you know, a lot of indigenous worldviews, and, like I said, even, you know, older forms of religious worldview as well.
Yeah. So in terms of the book Green the Paranormal, one of the things you suggested, for example, it was in all those aspects we referred to in terms of the supernatural, was that the practical steps that could be made. So I love the idea, for example, about the ghost hunters going into those abandoned buildings and sowing seeds. And I love the idea about people going out for the Sasquatch and planting trees. And the one I thought was absolutely amazing was the ufologists going out at night time, having those night gardens that they could go stargazing. I thought it's a magnificent idea, because you could put all the night scented flowers in there. Magical idea of them looking up to the stars. I thought that's a great idea.
And connecting with the place that they're in at the same time.
So I think that's, again, one of the things I've noticed from my like 20 years experience of the paranormal world in terms of ghosts, is that it has become very much voyeuristic. It's very much like, we are here, we want immediate results, now we're moving out the building. I've always tried to say, let's look at that building, let's look at the history of it, let's look at the future of it, let's look at the longevity of it, and where that building plays its role in the history of our society. Rather than just like, let's stomp in, take loads of pictures and go again. Because really that building has a story to tell. I've never really occurred to me that, again, the ecology of that building, because many of the more deserted ones, there's a fascinating place I go to called the Burslem Brickworks. Now, it was an old abandoned industrial Victorian brickworks producing like 1 million bricks a year. And it says the 1970s, they renovated whole sections of it. There's some that are untouched, and it has become taken over by wilderness. And there's one section that's, to me, like a secret world, where basically it's completely locked off, but it's open to the elements. So this garden and trees have grown up in this space, and it's a magical little piece of paradise where birds can pop into there, knowing that no humans can get anywhere near them, animals and wildlife. And it's actually, these buildings very often untouched by the humans, which is the way us like it, and they'd have their own natural ecology. Yeah. I mean, could it be that we can somehow encourage them in terms of their, because very often I work with locations in terms of heritage, but do we see them looking at the ecology of their heritage as opposed to just looking at ways of creating revenue from the heritage?
Yeah, well, I mean, really good there. You know, this is part of what Greening the Paranormal is about. A lot of my work in the past, over the past 10 years, has been about situating the paranormal in its social and cultural context. So in the same way that you were talking about, you know, going to haunted houses, but focusing on, you know, the historical, social, you know, milieu that occurred around that house in order to understand what's going on. And really, Greening the Paranormal is just taking that one step further out, because actually all of our social, historical, cultural systems, all of that kind of stuff is also embedded within ecological systems. You know, if we didn't have a planet here and we didn't have oxygen and all of the, you know, all of the important natural processes that are going on, then we wouldn't have the social and cultural systems that we have. So obviously, if the paranormal and paranormal experiences are embedded in society, psychology, and culture, then they're also going to be embedded in a deeper kind of ecological framework as well. And that ecological framework is also going to be embedded into other, you know, wider cosmic processes as well. So we take this ecological view seriously, then we've got to, you know, face up to the fact that these are all interconnected systems. So we can't study the ghosts in a haunted house without also studying the ecological conditions that kind of sustain that house. And, you know, we talk about like, you know, poltergeists or whatever, and we assume that they're the spirits of, you know, of deceased human beings, but it's entirely possible that they could be, you know, angry spirits of place, or, you know what I'm trying to say. One, a good example, do you know about the Skinwalker Ranch in America, in Utah?
No, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's a crazy.
Abra. That's what it sounds like. Skinwalker, did you say? Yeah. Wow.
The Skinwalker is kind of like a Native American shape-shifting kind of creature. But this ranch is called the Skinwalker Ranch. It's in Utah. And there was all sorts of crazy, weird UFO sightings and like ostensibly like portals opening up and weird stuff going on there. But one of the things that I thought about it was, you know, if we're trying to understand this stuff from an ecological perspective, then we need to also think about like the state of the land on this ranch and stuff. There's all of this horrible paranormal activity going on there that's terrifying the people who live there. I'm just wondering, you know, like, what is, you know, has this land been treated well? You know, is it happy with the way it's been farmed, for example? Are the nutrients depleted from the soil? Perhaps you know, all of these different factors might be playing some role in kind of manifesting this frightening paranormal experience that people have in this location because the land has been so badly mistreated. It's interesting.
It takes the concept of the rather archaic concept of stone tape theory, when recordings are made into the material of the building. We're taking this step further and taking it's a byproduct of the ground itself, and the entire environment. It's a much more holistic picture rather than just saying it's the structure of the timber or the stone that might be in a building. It's the entire environment that has led to these recordings, or these sightings, or these apparitions or anomalies.
Yeah, exactly. And also, just one extra little point to add on to there. If we take an animistic worldview seriously, then mind or consciousness or whatever is also, present in potentially, rocks and things like that. So, even the fabric of a building might, have its own, not just that stuff has been recorded onto the rock, but that the rock might also have its own, influence on the system as well. It's taking it to the extreme, but we can't really rule these things out. Not in my
actually, I think that's entirely understandable. I can really connect to it, with going, and probably Jonathan can as well, and taking the eco conditions into consideration when we're even looking for spirits, for people that have passed over. Absolutely, I think you've got a very valid point there. And we've had some amazing, interesting questions on here, haven't we? And statements as well. Stuart Legg has actually even done a Faereology. Like he's done a course in Faereology as well, right? Which I've seen Stuart come on my lives for quite a while, and not once has he mentioned that. So I'm like getting a whole new different view of the people on here. You as well, Jonathan?
I'm fascinating. If there was even a sort of hierarchy to fairies, I'll be fascinating to know what they are.
Yeah.
Well,
like a hierarchy to fairies.
Yeah, is a hierarchical structure, or even looking at the sociology of fairies? I mean, are they all the same? Are there different types? Is there a peer structure? Is there a fairy in charge?
I think if you look back to the sort of the older fairy lore, they talk about fairies as essentially living similar lives to us. So they had, they talk about the fairy queen and all of that kind of stuff. Like they would have that whole kind of social hierarchy. So that's like one angle on it. And then there's the more kind of like organic, kind of like nature spirity perspective as well. I think actually, chances are all of these different ideas about fairies, the truth is going to be somewhere in the middle of them. So there may be hierarchies and things like that, but their societies are probably not similar to human societies.
Something we're going to go and look at in a future broadcast is the idea of taking haunted spaces, is the idea of haunted woods, and why woodlands can be so spiritual. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, there's interesting research about trees that's coming out recently. The way that trees interact with each other. There's a great book called The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Voleben. And he talks about how, trees nurture each other. They create conditions that enable other trees to grow. They even, sustain each other, like dead tree stumps are still being provided with nutrients by other trees through these networks of fungi called a mycelium, which connect all of the different plants in the woodland, and also give the trees access to water. They form this it's a symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship between the tree and the root and the fungus. Because fungi can't photosynthesize, so they need to use the tree to get sugars, and the fungi then give the tree access to water. So I think when we're walking into a woodland ecosystem, we're walking into a really complex network of relationships between organisms, and we know that out of complexity, you get extraordinary kind of like byproducts. We have really complex brains, which enables us to do all of the crazy complex things that we do. So, when you walk into these locations where there are all of these various processes going on simultaneously, you're walking into a place where there's potential for something more, like a higher, I don't know how to phrase it, like an epiphenomenon maybe, or something else to emerge out the top of it. So yeah, woodlands are complex places. So I think when you're in a complex place, then it makes it more likely that you're going to have complex kinds of experiences.
I recently did a vigil in a woodland that was actually an old cemetery. So that I had ruined stone buildings. So I have stone structures. I have the remains of old wooden structures that have now gone and decayed. I have 5,500 people buried underneath me, and I have a very active woodland environment with its own complex. So being in that space, as you say, complex, because you're getting so many different conflicting environments, it was almost like noise. It was so much noise of all sorts, not just realistic noise, but just noise in terms of spirit energies. So fascinating spaces. So we will be coming on to woodlands and the legends and myths about woodlands itself, because and I think the mycelium, as a huge Star Trek fan, there's no it's perfectly logical. If anyone's seen next Star Trek Discovery, why use the mycelium network as a method of transfer, moving through the universe? Because the mycelium network in the Earth is obviously way more complex than we ever imagined, and in terms of neurological parallel is there. So I think it's something which is going to branch a whole new thing, and potentially we're going to see this whole surface of the Earth covered by mycelium network that we've ignored for generations, and realize that we've been denting this thing that's so important to our environment. But Dr. Jack, I want to talk to you about some of your other experiences. So not only have you been working on the crossover between ecology and the world religions, but also you looked at spiritual mediumship right early on when you started doing your undergraduate degree, I think it was.
Yeah.
Did you go to some? I was going to do some research, and you went to see a spiritualist medium group, a church.
Yeah. When I was doing my undergraduate dissertation, I did a degree in archaeology and anthropology in Bristol, and I became really interested in anthropology of religion, and particularly in the issue of spirits. So, why is it, we don't generally see spirits around us very often, but belief in spirits and spiritual beings is really widespread. So I was just interested to think, how is it that we come to believe so readily in something that we hardly ever encounter, or something that we rarely see in our everyday lives? And then obviously I came to find out that there are people who experience and interact with spirits on a daily basis. Anyway, so I started to go to spiritualist churches to try and talk to people. But for whatever reason, I found it was quite difficult for me to build a rapport up with these groups. So I decided that I would find somewhere that was a little bit more kind of like a little bit smaller, a little bit more kind of like cozy and intimate, where I could build up a stronger relationship with people and, delve deeper into, why it is that they believe in spirits. And I found this group, the Bristol Spirit Lodge, who lived, where they were based literally about 20-minute walk up the road from where I was living as a student at the time, which was a nice little coincidence. And so I got in touch with them. I went up there and had a chat with the circle leader, and we got on really well. And I was like, well, this is perfect. And she invited me to attend some seances. And, throughout the seances, I had some interesting experiences of my own. I saw like little flashing lights and things that I wouldn't necessarily have expected coming into it. I saw like a weird transfiguration of the medium's face. So it seemed to go like a green mask, and then it kind of slid down. Classical physical mediumship kind of stuff. And I had my own experience of my left hand seemingly becoming possessed. Quotation marks. Or whatever it was. It was a sensation in my arm that felt like, it was moving of its own accord. And it felt different. It wasn't as if it wasn't me that was willing it to move. So I had all of these experiences like early on doing my undergraduate dissertation. And it just made me think, there's more going on here than, the usual explanations, whether we're talking about like skeptical debunking explanations, or even the mainstream explanations of mediumship and spirit possession groups in anthropology and sociology. There was more going on, in terms of like how you can engage in these practices and have these experiences and all this kind of stuff than any of the kind of standard models allowed for. So my PhD ultimately blossomed out of that. And it's really an exploration of how we can approach these kinds of things without trying to reduce them down to a single explanatory framework. So I'll just give a quick example. In anthropology, the usual way of explaining something like spirit mediumship is that it performs a social function. It does something for people like, for people who are grieving, it allows them to feel, connected to a loved one, or it allows them to, come to terms with, death of a loved one, that kind of thing. So it's basically explained in terms of the function that it performs for people, and it's usually like a psychological function.
Mm.
But this doesn't really kind of like, it doesn't really cut the mustard. It doesn't explain how, for example, these kinds of experiences occur. It doesn't give a reason for, seeing flashes of light and things like that. So yes, it may perform a social function. In fact, it does. You can't argue with that. But there's also more going on beside that. So that's what my thesis is about. Is how can we develop a framework for incorporating that, the other things as well, without reducing it down to just a sociological or a psychological explanation.
That is fascinating. Lara, got any comments on that?
Jonathan's speechless. That's what's happening. I'm just gonna like bask in that, because it's a rare thing, Jonathan, for you to be speechless like that. So, totally take on board what you're saying. It's about connectivity, connecting people in, an area to help them be able to facilitate that loss, within themselves, and shift. Again, it's back to shifting as well. It's about, I suppose, explaining along the journey. It's not about ever coming to a conclusion. I don't think we'll ever get a conclusion in this life. I do feel as a medium that many different species probably, and people, spirit people. I was on Pure Paranormal radio show last night, and I put the concept out there of, what if we were actually the spirit ones to other people in another reality, right? And they're actually in bed going, can you hear that noise? Right? I can hear somebody talking, I can hear somebody walking. All right. Mm-hmm. So there's so much really to consider. And as a medium, I know that, I'm a trained grief counsellor. I'm a trained counsellor. I'm also in 1 foot in the science part, 1 foot in the spiritual part as well. I like to have an explanation, mainly probably because there's probably a little bit of curiosity and understanding in myself of how that can happen. I've kind of detached though from the whole kind of, I don't need to prove that to anybody, right? I don't need to find an explanation. It just is, right? Like if you're, fairies at the bottom of the garden, they exist, they just are, right? I can have very rational explanations for that, never to justify each other. People, my job isn't to show people, look, there's definitely, a spirit there. My job is exactly as you've talked about, to help reconnect people when they're going through grief, right? By letting them know their loved ones are okay, by providing evidence. And I've got to be honest, there's times where even I sit there and go, holy crap, I'm not clever enough to get that. Where does that come from? But I try not to get caught up in the how. Mm-hmm. Only there is. My job is a messenger and communicator. That's how I'm designed. It's not to question that, because once you start doing that, you're into the whole question of whether God exists or not. You get groups of people that have orchestrated religion, right, around the world, right, all following each other, like sheep, right, just trusting in, one thing in particular. Then I find it very incredible that they would judge people like yourself or me for argument's sake, right? That just doesn't make sense to me. I feel that if you're brave enough to actually tell the world what you see, it's not really for them to judge, right? I've moved on by that time, and I'd like to think that other people do as well. Your job is to just show this, to draw attention to it. You know what I mean? Not to get hung up in all the details.
Chris, we've gotten obviously lots and lots of comments online. Chris has said researchers are approaching mediumship more from a phenomenological perspective. Mm-hmm. Well, I would argue that is the definition of research, in terms of phenomena is the only thing you can document and measure. Would you say that there is another approach in terms of creating understanding?
Well, what I think is a phenomenological approach. My understanding of a phenomenological approach is, in philosophy, phenomenology is about it's about our experience of the world. So understanding the world based on our first person experience, which can include all sorts of crazy kinds of experiences as well. And I think, over the past 150 years or so, most research on mediumship has actually been empirical research, where they've focused on trying to verify the existence of discarnate spirits, for example, or to verify the existence of the medium's, psychokinesis or things like that. So research has always been based in the lab, and it's always been extremely extremely critical. The only thing that is important is the results or the data that you get out of it. And there has been, over the past 10 years or so, and my research is a part of that as well, a shift towards researching the phenomenology of mediumship, which is how mediumship is actually experienced by the people who practice it. Because we can look at evidence like spreadsheet statistics about whether the mediumship reading is a hit or any of that kind of stuff, but it doesn't give us any of the processes that underlie that experience. Whereas a phenomenological approach that takes seriously what people actually experience, how they experience the process of mediumship, we can get insights into those kinds of, insights into the processes that are behind the mediumship experience. There's a great work by Dr. Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Research Institute, where they do research with mediums, and they have this really stringent vetting process for mediums to go through in order to be participants in their studies. But they've also started to research the phenomenology of mediumship for these people, and it's enabling them to kind of like make distinctions in the experiences that mediums have between like mediumship on the one hand, which is like communication with the dead, and then psychic experiences on the other hand, which are kind of like, connections with the living and telepathy and all of that kind of stuff. And the interesting thing about it is when you look at it from a phenomenological perspective, like how they experience it, they experience both of these things in very kind of different ways. So it's starting to tease out the kind of underlying processes that are going on in mediumship and that kind of stuff.
Right. My thing is, are mediums setting these boundaries, right? Are setting these questions, right? If you go into academia, you get academics that set, the parameters, right? You don't get mediums coming along setting the parameters for academics. So why are academics setting the parameters for mediums?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, academia is all about trying to fit stuff into a framework. Academics are going to be coming at it with their own baggage and things like that, and trying.
That's because of their need to understand.
Yeah.
They need to measure it, right? And they can only measure as far as their intellect will allow them. But if mediumship and connecting in any way, like even with fairies and stuff, actually resides in a different energy, in a different way of the brain working and operating. That's what I believe anyway.
Yeah.
It can't be set by people that are linear thinking, for argument's sake.
Yeah. Well, people like myself, there are researchers who are interested in trying to understand this other way of thinking about the world, or another way.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do by taking people's experiences seriously and treating people's experiences as the data.
In defense of science, the argument, one of the problems is, because my speciality was quantum theory, and I realized it's a really big subject trying to understand that, and obviously very theoretical. And there's an issue of reductionism, and what happens in science is you end up with massive reductionism, and you basically get a research project and funding and budget for a single abstract to look at one little project and not outside it. And the research is then done to look at this little thing. And if you go, yeah, but I want the bigger picture, it's like, well, your funding was for this, you've got to do this. So there is, in physics, there's a classic thing called the Young's duality, the Tussle experiment. And there was this whole thing about, is a photon a wave or is it a particle? And there was a whole lot of experiments done to try and look definitively for the past 100 years, is a photon a wave or is it a particle? Classical theory was saying it was a wave, quantum theory saying it's a particle. And then what happened was basically the device, the equipment, the experiment set up basically would give the answer you went in with. So you go, this experiment's to prove it's a wave. Yeah, got a wave. This experiment's to prove it's a particle. Got a particle. And unfortunately, you're basically getting the answer you were going out to prove. And that's a problem with reductionism. And that's a problem with, again, with that element of research is that you end up proving, but you're proving the bit you wanted to sort of focus on. And that's why the ecology look of it is so much more important, because it's trying to comprehend this very big and very difficult subject, which phenomenological and research is going to really struggle to produce the parameters it's going to need. Sorry, I'll go to, if I start talking, you won't shut me up.
No.
But Dr. Hunter, I want to talk about, have you ever seen...
Jonathan, I'm there going, why?
Sorry?
even I'm there going, why would they spend loads of money in actually deciding either or? Why does it always have to be an either or? Right?
Well,
What
for some,
information resides in between that?
yeah, sometimes it will show parameters, and it will show it agreed with it, or it slightly agreed with it, or it came in within the parameters, or it didn't show it, or it did show it. So sometimes, you know, there's a broad spectrum, but generally, in terms of the very big picture about why we're here, this reductionism tends to just focus on a little edge element. It's really not the bigger picture, which is struggling. That's the problem with science generally. But at least it's a framework, and it's a framework of fundamental understanding and truth.
Yes.
If there is a thing called truth, it's going to be mathematics and nowhere else.
I was saying you can't build a fence without having the posts, right? So even mediums need frameworks, right? But
Yes.
we work in reverse to what you're describing, right?
Sorry.
We work in reverse. We position the framework first, right? Then we use the framework in order to access other information. For example, it's possible to fix a washing machine without actually reading the manual. As long as you have a fundamental understanding of some basic framework, you can fix a washing machine without reading the whole damn book.
Or you can make a massive mistake and flood your kitchen.
No, it's called, there's an energy, Jonathan, is what I'm saying, that when you're in that energy, right, and trust in your own ability, you can connect with that energy, you know how to fix the washing machine. You always did do.
Or you could electrocute yourself and kill yourself.
That's fear. That's fear.
Well, I just say bring in the professionals. But I want to talk, Dr. Hunter, about physical mediumship. Would you say that you've ever seen any evidence of physical mediumship?
Well, yes. The face that I saw, the mask. I mean, the transfiguration is a classical physical mediumship phenomenon. So I think, you know, that I've seen. I did see ectoplasm once.
Wow.
But unfortunately, I wasn't 100% convinced by it.
I was going to say you didn't
not
there yet.
I would say you weren't in a position to grab a sample and get it down to the lab for analysing.
No.
I think you're probably going to think, because you haven't seen it before, you've got no prior logical perception of what the expectation is of what you should be seeing. There's nothing attached to that perception, you see. That's gathered over time by the way the brain works. So,
and this is why I don't want to rule it out completely, because I don't know actually what ectoplasm looks like. And, you know, if you read the historical accounts of materializations, it can be, you know, practically indistinguishable from, you know, physical matter. It can be just like a real human being, or it can be like silk or clothes and things like that. So, you know, I don't want to rule out this experience of ectoplasm. I'll just give you a little bit of the context of it. It was in a seance at the Bristol Spirit Lodge with a visiting physical medium. And they basically said, the medium, or the spirit speaking to the medium said, do you want to see some ectoplasm? And everyone was like, yeah, we want to see some ectoplasm. And the spirit was like, okay, turn off the lights then. So he turned off the lights and he was like, turn up the music. So he turned up the music and waited for a little while, in the darkness, feeling the same vibes. And then
you already look like you can't believe you're actually saying that, never mind seen it, right?
It was a wonderful
everything, yeah.
I loved it. And and then the spirit says, okay, you can turn on the red lights now. So they turn on the red lights, and after there's been like a few minutes of sitting in darkness, and coming out of the cabinet, which is a cornered off corner in the room, there was this thin strip of silk, or it looked like silk, that was attached to the top of a spirit trumpet, which is like a metal cone basically that spirits talk through in seances. And yeah, exactly. And it was they float around in the seance room, and this strand of silk was connected to the top of the trumpet. And then the spirit said, "Do you want to see the ectoplasm moving?" And everyone was like, "Yeah, we'd love to see the ectoplasm moving." So it said, "Switch off the lights, turn the music up," and then so we'd have to do the whole thing again. And then when they turned the lights back on again, when the spirit said it was okay, all it was doing, it was like someone was holding on to the end of it inside the cabinet, and it was kind of like waggling about a little bit. So I wasn't like 100% convinced by that at all. But that said, I can't rule out the possibility that it could have been real.
You mean literally somebody was actually doing this with the trumpet?
Yeah, they were waggling the strand of silk ectoplasm that was attached to the top of the trumpet, and it wasn't much more exciting than that. So I did see ectoplasm, but I'm not sure whether it was real ectoplasm or not.
So you just undermined the whole goddamn story. That's what I was thinking.
I know. You had great.
We were, listen, Jonathan and I had our bags packed, right? And we were heading down the street. And then suddenly we slammed the brakes on and we're like, hang on. Wait a minute.
That's the problem with these kind of things, with the paranormal. It's not going to let you get the But, you know, I want to stress as well that this visiting medium, he was different. There was a set group of mediums at the Bristol Spirit Lodge who were developing mediumship of their own kind. You know, they were trying to develop physical mediumship and trance and all of that kind of stuff. And they were the ones that I did most of my seances with. And it was with them that I had my most interesting experiences. And this visiting medium, you know, you had to pay him and all of this kind of stuff. So it's a different, I wouldn't want to tar the whole of the practices of the lodge because of this visiting medium's, you know, ectoplasmic materialization.
It is an absolutely fascinating subject, and I think we need to come back to it. I think we need to look at the whole transmedium element of it, because it is a big subject. And as a physicist, you know, physical violation of the laws of physics get me very excited, and I'm waiting for things to start moving of their own accord. So I'm still waiting. But Dr. Jack, we are almost running out of time. So Dr. Jack Hunter, thank you so much for coming on. That was fascinating. If anyone wants a copy of his book, if you go to the supernaturalmagazine.com, look at Fairies at the bottom of the garden, search for that. I'll ask Norrie to put it up higher so you can find it. And there's links to Amazon where you can buy his book, Greening the Paranormal. So Dr. Jack Hunter, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of lockdown and your teaching. Good luck with your sacred space. That looks beautiful. The little picture on your blog looks amazing with the little garden you have created. It's beautiful. I think we should all go out and create a little sacred space in our own gardens.
Definitely.
So thank you so much and have a great time.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So Lara, that was fascinating.
I tell you what, that was incredible. And going by the reactions and people here, this has been fascinating. I thought we were only doing 40 minutes and now we've done the hour. You know,
I know, it was so good. I thought, let's keep going.
Oh, we had to keep going, and everybody's been delighted. I have learned so much. Have you?
Yeah, totally. Yes, because it was a whole subject that was really not beyond me. And I've got a whole new approach now to sort of slightly edging away from phenomenological and look at a new way of thinking about sort of collecting evidence and trying to get an understanding.
Yeah, I mean, Chris Conley was saying about science and explanation with mediums and stuff like that. That, Chris, I totally hear you. But you see, the problem with that is they try and say that it's black and white and they've got to prove it or disprove it, right? It becomes not about the explanation. And I think the fairy thing is the same, isn't it? It becomes not about the explanation. We love to see evidence, but, you know, it's one of those never ending, right? Like, is there an end to the universe type questions, isn't it?
So I think, even though for me down here near Portsmouth, it's raining at the moment. So wherever you are in the country, I think you should need to get out into the country, get out into nature and start looking for those fairies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, guys, for calling in and sharing this journey with us. It's been fabulous. Next week, what have we got next week?
I was hoping you were going to tell me.
I can't remember. I can't. Oh, God almighty.
We will put it up on the Facebook page probably later today about what we have got coming up next week. So we've got different guests every single week. We're going to talk for about an hour with that special guest. Oh, Lara's looking it up. Lara, you've got about 10 seconds.
Yeah.
It's ticking.
Okay. Yeah, Steve Parsons next week. It's the 24th next week, isn't it?
Yes, was it? No, it can't be. It's the 10th now, so it's the 17th.
Oh, 17th. No, we don't. We have Helena Byrne next week.
There we go. Helena Byrne will be coming on to talk to us. So we're going to information up on the Facebook page so you can see who we will be talking to next week.
Right, because I can't get the document on my phone because it's an iPhone rather.
No problem.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Lara. I will see you next week. Thank you everyone for contributing onto the comments. You can watch us again either on YouTube or the Facebook page. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.